Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm going to have there's a book I wrote called Who is the King in America? And it's you. But I have a presentation, and I thought I like big picture stuff. So there's my website. The most common form of government in world history is what? It's on the screen, so it's kings. And so one of the things I decided to do was research every single century of recorded human history to verify that the most common form of government is a king. And so, do you know when writing was invented? It's on the screen. It's around 3300 BC. So you open up a secular history book and it says Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Today that's Iraq. So writing started as an accounting method. So do you know what the very first invention was? It's in the Bible. So Cain was a what? What was Cain's job? It says he was a tiller of the soil. So the first invention ever was the plow. And so when you study world history, they call it anthropology. And people, the first thing they did was they transitioned from hunter-gatherers to agriculture. And so the Bible has Adam and Eve plucking the fruit off the tree. So they were gathering. But then Cain was a tiller of the soil. And so that's the first invention, was the plow. And so the next thing that started happening is people started hitting each other with the plows. Like Cain, they would have the plow, and so Cain kills Abel, but you got people start killing each other. And when people are randomly killing each other, what's your response? Well, you sort of gathered together with your friends for protection. And so people began to gravitate together and form the very first cities. And so when you get people together and there's random violence, somebody's always a little bit better knowing how to fight than the rest. And so everybody says, hey, you be our captain. And you fight, you win, you defend yourselves. That's a good thing. But then this captain, everybody's appreciative of them. And then they end up getting married and have kids. And then the kids start acting like they're sort of special because their dad was the one that helped deliver everybody. And then before you know it, you got this political family that everybody wants to be friends with. And before you know it, you got yourself a king. And so what happens is kings claim to own everything in town. So everybody in town has to sort of butter up to this political family. And if you're not their friend, you're kicked out of town. And so kings would tax and take stuff from people, and they wanted to count it. So writing started as an accounting method for kings to keep track of everything they own. And so in China, the very first accounting was knots and ropes. They didn't invent the calculator yet. And so they would have like knots and ropes, and they'd have a long string of knots and a shorter string, and that would be the way they would count and keep track of how much stuff is in the warehouse. And then in Asia, they invented an abacus. Does anybody know what an abacus is? It's a little board with rods and beads, and they would slide the beads back and forth, and they'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, but then they would scoop one over here for the 10, and then they would go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they would have 2. So you could look at the beads and sort of keep an accounting. But in Sumeria, they would have tokens in dishes. And so there'd be a barn. It's like, well, how many bushels of wheat are in the barn? And they'd look in the dish, and there'd be each little token would represent like a bushel. And then they started making markings in the tokens because they were made out of clay. And so have you ever tallied where you draw the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a line across for 5? That was the beginning of writing. It was an accounting method for kings to keep track of everything they own. And then kings wanted to keep track of their genealogy. In other words, they wanted to trace themselves back to that very first king that defeated the enemy, that started the whole thing off, to claim, well, I'm related to him. And then kings would keep track of their decrees, and then they would keep track of the stars because they would claim that they were like divinely appointed. But the common people didn't read because they didn't make decrees. They didn't own anything to keep track of. And so reading and writing was just for the upper class. And so Egyptian hieroglyphics were invented around 3000 BC. And they had 3,000 hieroglyphics. So in Sumeria, they had about 1,500 different cuneiform characters. But in Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. And only 1% of Egypt could read. Reading and writing was the scribes' secret knowledge. They would keep the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. They were needed to interpret those complicated things, right? They'd have all these hieroglyphs. I don't know what that means. Let's get the senior scribe. And he'd show up and he'd go, oh, yes, that means this, that. They go, oh, you're so smart. And then the Chinese characters were invented around 2600 BC, and they had 10,000 characters, the Yellow Emperor. And then Indus Valley invented some characters around 2600 BC, but when Islam came through in the 7th century AD, they destroyed so much stuff that nobody's ever interpreted it. So we don't know what those characters mean. You know how they interpreted the Egyptian hieroglyphics? Remember I showed you that slide? You ever hear of Napoleon? So Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. And he brought with him some archaeologists. And they discovered who knows the name of the stone? Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone had Egyptian hieroglyphics that nobody had a clue what they meant. And then there was some other Middle Eastern language, but then there was Greek. And so they knew what the Greek said. And so then they would sort of look at this middle and they would start to say, well, you know what? This character probably is the same as this. And then they finally interpreted that. And then they interpreted and they unlocked what all the Egyptian hieroglyphics meant. And Neil deGrasse Tyson is an astrophysicist. And in his Cosmos TV series, he had one episode where he stood in the desert and in Iraq, and he says it was here around 5,000 years ago between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we learned how to write. So here he's saying 5,000 years. So we're around 2000 AD. So this would be around 3000 BC. And so here's a secular scientist saying that writing was invented around 3000 BC. So Franklin Roosevelt said 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many abortive attempts to exile God. And so he said the number of 5,000 years. And then there's an author named Richard Overy, and he wrote The Times Complete History of the World. And he said, no date appears before the start of human civilizations around 5,500 years ago and the beginning of a written or pictorial history. So he says that writing, whether it's written or pictorial, because they used to write with little pictures, was around 5,500 years ago. Now, let's round it out to 6,000, because some of the founders use that number. 6,000 years of history is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. So how many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. 60 people living 100 years each back to back, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. And 60 people living 100 years each back to back. I actually spoke one time and they had a 102-year-old lady, and she was holding her either the great or great-great-granddaughter who was like 1 year old. And so here you have, right, one person's 100 years, and then there's another one that's just born. And so you do that 60 times, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. And now that we have 6,000 years of history that have been written down, let's look at them. What do they show? Well, they show that every single generation has kings. And these kings keep conquering. And if they didn't die off, and if they would keep living, they'd continue to keep conquering until finally, right, they would want to conquer the world. And so the first story that we have record of kings conquering is Nimrod Tower of Babel. And this is in the plains of Shinar, which is in Iraq, which is in the Mesopotamia, what they call the Fertile Crescent. So if you look at a map, if you go from like, Egypt, the Nile, and then through the Holy Land, and then up through part of Turkey, and then you come back down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers down to Persia. And so that's like a crescent. And so they call it the Fertile Crescent because it's the two river valleys, the Nile River Valley, and then there's the Jordan, but then there's the Tigris and Euphrates. And that's where civilization began. And so somebody wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. The author's name is Jared Diamond. And he said, why did civilization start in Mesopotamia? And he said, well, there's interesting things. They have the most domesticable grains. And those are grains that you can plant and get a consistent harvest from. Barley, oats, wheat, and flax. And the rest of the world didn't have that. Africa had, fruits and stuff, but you can't store those. They rot pretty quick. India had rice, and China had rice, and that was sort of limited. America did not have domesticable grains. They had some rudimentary corn, but back then it was like really small. And then Mesopotamia had domesticable animals. What's that? Well, a cow, an ox, a goat, sheep, right? And these are things that you can, put in a pen and raise. Well, Africa did not have domesticable animals. They had zebra, which sort of look like a horse, but they have an ornery personality that you can't ride them. And they had antelope, but they run 60 miles an hour. How are you going to domesticate them? And they had big elephants that you could sort of domesticate, but not a whole lot. And so in India they had, elephants, but they can't really pull a plow, and so they didn't. And then China didn't have much except a pig and chickens. But in America, they didn't really have domesticable animals. They had dogs, maybe get a dog to pull a sled, but nothing that could pull a plow. And South America had llamas, but you really couldn't, train them to do stuff. So Mesopotamia got a heads up with what? Domesticable grains and domesticable animals. And so they were quicker to switch from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, because they had the agriculture that you could grow and plant. And so historically, whatever group transitions from hunter-gatherers to agriculture always has a step up over the rest, because the other ones are still hunting what they're going to eat that night. But if you can store up grain, you can do other things. So the first thing is you start wanting to count the grain. So now you develop mathematics and accounting. And then you can do military conquests, because if you deplete the soil, you got to get more soil. And so, and then you can develop plows that turn into weapons. And so that's how civilization started in the Fertile Crescent. Anyway, so the first civilization is in the Fertile Crescent. It's called Nimrod's Tower of Babel. And Josephus, a Jewish commentator, said Nimrod wanted to build his tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And so there's the plains of Shinar, so it's flat, and the flood waters would come. He said, well, I want to build this. And so Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said Nimrod made everyone in town bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. And so he's defiant against God. I'm going to survive your next flood. And he's oppressive over man. And he gets everybody to build this tower. And God comes down and confuses the languages. And the people what? They scatter. But it's almost like every generation since has tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. They keep wanting to get it together again. And they say, this time we're going to do it right. So let's get all the power together again. And so you track it through history. And I don't know if you can see this picture, but it's a snapshot from the movie Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. How many saw that? It's sort of an older movie now. But it's sort of sci-fi, and they have this metal robot chasing Arnold Schwarzenegger. And they blow the robot up into a million little silver pieces, and everybody in the audience says, they got rid of it. But then the little silver pieces melt into little silvery droplets, and they start rolling together. It's like a silvery pool. And then out of it starts this thing somehow reassembles itself and climbs out of this pool and starts chasing them again. And everybody in the audience is like, how do you stop this thing? It's like, how do you stop this desire to rebuild the Tower of Babel? God scattered it, but every generation since tries to rebuild it. And each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse, because with military advancements, the kings can kill more people. And with technological advancements, the kings can track more people. So, adding to the story, I noticed something that's called the golden ratio, or phi, P-H-I, not pi, but phi, and or the Fibonacci sequence. So it's a number plus the previous number equals the next number. Then that number plus the previous number equals the next number, that number. And it's a gradual rate of expansion that you observe in geometry, like in a seashell, where it does the little circle, then it comes around with a bigger circle, and then it comes around with a bigger circle. And you observe it in nature with tornadoes, the way they spin, or a hurricane, or a galaxy. And so different people in academia decide to apply this phi, this golden ratio, to other areas, even investments. So when Bitcoin first started taking off, they go, it's going to grow at this exponential rate, and this geometric expansion rate. And so I thought, well, has anybody applied this to history, to all the kingdoms, and to see, are they expanding? And so that's what I did over these 6,000 years of recorded history. And so you have Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And then 2500 BC, you have Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, or Iraq. And the oldest story ever written in any language is the what? Epic of Gilgamesh, in this ancient Akkadian language. And the story, the epic, has that Gilgamesh is the first one to build a wall around a city. Somebody had to be the first one to do that. And Gilgamesh was going on this long journey to meet this old guy who survived a global flood. And talks about this old guy building a boat, covering with tar and pitch, filling it full of animals. After the flood, they repopulated the world. And it's the story of Noah, written in 1,000 years before Moses. Matter of fact, over 100 ancient civilizations have flood stories in their ancient past. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, right? The whole world was covered with water. And so then 2250 BC, you have Sargon of Akkadian, and he conquers a bunch of walled cities from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then there's 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs and 5,000 years of Chinese emperors. And then 700 BC, Assyria is the biggest empire on the planet. And we know it from the Bible. Assyria took the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive. But then Assyria is conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, which is conquered by Cyrus of Persia. And so in the 5th century BC, Persia's got the biggest empire that the planet had ever seen to this point. And you know that story in the Bible because Cyrus of Persia is the one who let the Jews go back in, rebuild the temple. But then Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great. 330 BC, And he's got the biggest empire that the planet had seen up to this point. And he stopped from going into India by Chandragupta and the Maurya Empire, and it controls a quarter of the world's population there in India. And then around 25 BC, Augustus Caesar and the Roman Empire, which is the biggest empire that the planet had ever seen up to this point. And matter of fact, Augustus Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system. It was called the census. That was like new technology back then. If he could have had 5G and cell phones and satellites and cameras, he would have been tempted to track everybody with that. And then you have in Africa an Ascamite empire, a huge area in Sudan and Ethiopia. And then you have 450 AD, Attila the Hun. And he has an army of 500,000 men, and he's wiping out cities across Europe, Mainz and Reims, and he's headed toward Paris. And a young woman named Genevieve gets all of Paris to fast and pray. And for some reason, Attila skips sacking Paris. So St. Genevieve is considered the patron saint of Paris because she got everybody to pray. But anyway, Attila the Hun had the biggest empire the planet had seen up to this point. And then there's the Byzantine Empire with Justinian, and then Islam comes along in the 7th century AD, and it conquers from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean, conquers Spain, and it's got the biggest empire that the planet had seen up to this point. But then the Muslims are stopped from invading Europe by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, 732 AD, and his grandson is Charlemagne, and he's got the biggest empire. He's crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD. And then the Vikings come along in the year 1000, and they have boats with low keels, and they could go up every river in Europe and in Russia. And you could be hundreds of miles away from the ocean, and you think you're safe, and all of a sudden there'd be hundreds of these Viking ships that would pull ashore. They'd just get out, they'd just start killing, and they'd kill the men, and then throw the women over their shoulders, and they'd get back on the boat and sail back to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And a lot of women that they captured were Christians. And then these Christian women would have to have kids with their Viking husband. And then when he's off raiding someplace else, they would raise the kids to be Christian. And in 2 or 3 generations, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark became Christian. So good job, ladies. And, and then you had Genghis Khan in the 1200s, and he conquers from Korea to Hungary. They have composite bows like bow and arrows, but it's instead of the 6-foot-long English longbow with the little recurve on it, it could shoot as far as the English longbow, like 300 yards, but they could shoot on horseback. And so you would have hundreds of thousands of these Mongols come with their bows and arrows, and they would, and so Genghis Khan kills 30 million people from Korea to Hungary to Russia and has the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen to this point in the 1200s. And then his grandson's Kublai Khan that runs China. And then there's Tamerlane in the 1300s, and he kills another 17 million across Central Asia. And then you have across the ocean, and you have the Americas. And you have Montezuma, and he controls the Aztec Empire. And they're capturing neighboring tribes and bringing them to the top of their pyramids and ripping out their beating heart for the sun god. And then in Inca, Peru, you have Atahualpa, and the entire Inca Empire is, everybody's a slave of the state, and he's in charge. And then the King of Spain, 1500s. He has the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen up to this point. The sun never set on the Spanish Empire. His son was Philip, and that's what the Philippines are named after. The Philippines are named after King Philip of Spain. And so Spain had the biggest empire in the 1500s. And then in the 1600s, the King of France had the biggest empire. Louis XIV, the Sun King, because his servants were planets that revolved around him every day, so he was like the sun. And again, he owned the land that we are on right now. This used to be Louisiana territory. And then in the 1800s, the King of France, the King of England, became the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top. And so anybody that can do plotting can see that this is going to max out on a global level, right? And Jesus says wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. And so these empires keep getting bigger because with military advancements, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a big long phalanx spear that the Greek soldiers had, or a scimitar sword, the curved sword that the Muslims had, or gunpowder that the Chinese invented, right? The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And with technology improving, the kings can count and keep track of more people. And so these empires keep getting bigger and bigger, and at some point it's going to max out on a global level. If any of these dictators had not have died, any one of them would have been happy to keep killing. I mean, here's Genghis Khan, kills 30 million. And so when he dies, the Mongols decide to have this enormous funeral. And they stop all their conquering. They even divert a river, and they bury Genghis Khan's body in a lead box in the bottom of the river. And then they re-divert the river back to cover it over. And then they kill everybody that was a part of doing that. So nobody could remember where he was buried. And but then when they started conquering again, by that time the other countries learned how to fight on horseback with composite bows, and so the Mongols didn't. But if any of these dictators hadn't have died, any one of them would have been happy to be the Antichrist. So in that sense, death is a blessing, because the devil has to start from scratch and find somebody else to try to turn into a dictator. And now, why does it keep happening that we have these empires? It goes back to the fall in the garden and selfishness coming into each of our own human DNA. And Cain killing Abel, and one king taking a kingdom from another king. So St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. And you put some natives in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief. You put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader, right? It's a hierarchical system. If you're friends with that important person, you are more equal. If you are not their friends, you're less equal. And if you're their enemy, you're left out of the group, right? You're not invited to the party, right? And so it's this hierarchical system, and it keeps repeating itself because it's in each of our own human DNA. And so again, you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, right? Or you're a slave. People say, I thought slavery started in 1619. No, wherever you had the first king on top, you had slaves on the bottom, right? It's a hierarchical system, and it keeps repeating itself around the world because it's in each of our own fallen, selfish human DNA. Now, what if you were the king? That'd be pretty neat. And then you have, let's say, a sister, she gets married, has a kid, and now the kid's a teenager, hanging around the wrong friends, drinking and partying, and hits somebody with the car and kills them. And now this teenager is facing prison time, manslaughter charges. And your sister comes begging to you and says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get put in prison, are you? What are you going to say to your own sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if somebody's family or friends with the king, they get special treatment. And they're not family and friends, they don't get it. And if someone wants to point out your favoritism, you're going to be embarrassed and want to shut them up. It just happens. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And so there's a pull of a magnet, like the law of gravity. Power wants to concentrate. You know what Newton's law of gravity is? The lesser mass is attracted to the greater mass. So you got some important person, like if a billionaire walked in the room, what would we all want to do? We'd all want to go over there and meet him, right? famous. And so if there's somebody that with power, everybody wants to be friends with the ones with power, and they end up getting more powerful. And there's the movie Lord of the Rings. So there's a scene where you have Gandalf, and he tells this little Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And then the movie goes on where the little Frodo character offers the ring to Gandalf. And Gandalf says, don't tempt me, Frodo. And the special effects, the room gets dark. And he says, I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe. Understand, Frodo, I would use this ring from a desire to do good, but through me it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine. What's he talking about? Every now and then you get a good king. And he wants to concentrate power so he can do good more efficiently. But he doesn't live forever. And at some point he dies and all that power is handed over to some son or grandson that's a lousy ruler, but likes his job, and he gets oppressive. So what's the Bible example? Joseph in Egypt. He was a godly man. He concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did that particular Pharaoh do with the power? Joseph, the Pharaoh, and then the Pharaoh did what to the children of Israel? Well, this particular Pharaoh fed them, right? Maybe give them land, and then gave him the land of Goshen, gave him food, and then even gave him jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, make them slaves, and even throw their sons in the Nile River. So that's the dilemma, right? We get a good leader in there, and he's pushing our side. And we're like, yeah, he can take a little extra power because he's pushing our agenda. But he's setting a precedent. So when he's voted out and another person gets in, they're going to say, okay, where do we start off? Well, I got all this extra power. And he gets to push his agenda and makes it even worse. I mean, Jimmy Carter started the Department of Education. Right? He was, I want to make sure everybody's educated. And then Ronald Reagan gets in, and he had a chance to take apart the Department of Education. But instead he said, we can do good with it. And the devil sits back for like 8 years. Yeah, you can have it for 8 years because it's coming back to me. And when I get in control, I'm going to push the trans agenda and this critical race theory and everything else, right? So you get one guy in there and you say, let him take power, but it gets handed over to the other guy. And then it's used for evil. And so these kings claimed to be divinely appointed. The Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be the son of the god Osiris. Incan emperors claimed to be delegates to the sun god. Muslim caliphs claimed to be the successor of the messenger of Allah. And then they Christianized it in Europe and called it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so whatever my will is must be his will because he put me here. So I can pretty well do anything I want. And so you see, the most common form of government in world history is what? Kings. And if you're friends with the king, you're what? More equal. You're not friends with the king, you're what? Less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're what? Dead, or you're a slave. And then as the centuries go on, the kingdoms do what? They keep getting bigger. Why? Because with military advancements, kings can kill more people, and with technological advancements, they can track more people. And so in the 1600s, you had King Louis XIV of France, and he said, I am the state. Talk about an ego. And then one time they said, King, you can't do this particular thing, it's illegal. And he says, it is legal because I wish it. It's like, okay, I get it. The law is nothing more than the king's wishes, and he just happens to have a really powerful army to make you obey. And here's the King of England, King James. Jamestown's named after him. He says, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. Can you begin to see why America's founders wanted to break away from a king? And so here's the King of England and his empire at its greatest extent. India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, countries in Africa, from Egypt down to Sudan, down to South Africa, and America. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one-world government guy with him at the top. And America's founders decided they didn't like that. And so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. And so kings have subjects who are subjected to their will. Democracies and republics have citizens. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-sovereign, co-ruler, co-king. Right? So you're a citizen of America. You are a co-king of America. And so it took centuries before America was able to break away from the King of England. And here's a quote from James Wilson. He signed the Declaration, signed the Constitution, was put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live. So this is, well, remember I said rounded out to 6,000, that's because you have people like him using the number 6,000. But he said something unique happened in America. And then there's Secretary of State Daniel Webster. And he said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. Now, why would there be anarchy throughout the world if the American Constitution failed? So you have 6,000 years, and people are suffering under the thumbs of pharaohs and sultans and czars and emperors and dictators. And the people would say to themselves, gee, if only we could rule ourselves without a king. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And in America, we did it. And if we blow it, there's nothing left for the world to look forward to this side of heaven than what? Russian dictators, Iranian Ayatollah dictators, Chinese dictators, North Korean dictators. It's going to be a gang war on a global scale, and human rights are going to be crushed. We'll just be pawns in their battles. So, the question is, how did America come about? Well, you have the Roman Empire persecutes Christians, and 313 AD, Constantine stops the persecution and legalizes Christianity, and then the whole Roman Empire becomes Christian. And then they're attacked by Attila the Hun. When that threat's over, they're attacked by Islam. And so Muhammad his father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 8. His grandfather, guardian, dies when he's 12. He's taken in by an uncle who's a merchant. And so Muhammad would go with his uncle to different cities and hear about their different religions. And in Persia, they had Zoroastrian religion, where they believed that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all the guy's desires. And so Muhammad heard that and got incorporated into his faith. In Arabia, they had a rock they thought had fallen from the moon. And so they began their calendar with the first sight of the crescent moon. And they would kiss this meteor rock and walk around it. And so Muhammad kissed that rock. And so that got incorporated into Islam. And then some Jewish stuff, some Christian stuff. Anyway, he puts his faith together, and he's a religious leader for 12 years and only makes 70 converts. And then he gets confrontational, and then he gets chased out of town, and then he starts robbing caravans. And so he becomes a military leader. And so Muhammad's warriors conquer Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom right down there at the bottom. And then they conquer Arabia. And then the Muslims conquer Jerusalem. And Jerusalem had been a Christian city since Constantine. His mom, St. Helena, went over there and built all these cathedrals. And then the Muslims conquered Syria. Syria's in the news. Did you know Syria was the first country to completely be Christian? Evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria. And the Syrian Christians evangelized east into India and China the same way that the Greek Christians evangelized west into the Roman Empire, until the Muslims invaded Syria in 648 AD and conquered it. And then the Muslims invaded Egypt. Did you know Egypt was completely Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until Amir ibn al-As conquers it. And then they conquer into Persia and they conquer North Africa. Did you know there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century? Until the Umayyad Muslims came through on their Arabian horses and stirrups and scimitar swords. And then they conquer into Armenia, which used to be completely Christian. And then they conquered into Spain. So the Muslims were fighting on horseback, but the Spaniards were still fighting on foot. And so in 10 years, the Muslims conquer all of Spain. They cross the Pyrenees, they conquer southern France, and they're stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. And then they would invade Europe and kill, and so they raided Rome. And they trashed the church called the Basilica of St. Peter's, and they trashed the bones of St. Peter. Then they trashed the church of St. Paul's outside the wall, and they destroyed St. Paul's bones. And so it was after that that Pope Leo decided to build a 39-foot wall around the Vatican, which is still there to this day. I went to school in college in Rome for 6 months, and we got a chance to go there all the time. There's a little bus stop right there, and I stood at that bus stop. And then the Turks converted to Islam, and they conquered into what is today Turkey. And Turkey used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. And that's the land where Paul spoke and John spoke and all those cities mentioned in the book of Revelation. To the church at Ephesus and Sardis and Thyatira and Smyrna and Pergamum and Philadelphia, all those cities were wiped out by the invading Muslim Turks. And so the Greek Christians beg the Catholic Christians for help. And when you understand, the Greeks thought they were the true Christians because they spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. And their land was where John spoke and Paul spoke. And they viewed the Catholic West as the church split. And the split came down to 2 words in the Nicene Creed. The Greeks said the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father, and the West says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now, as important as doctrinal issues are, the Muslims could care less. They wanted to kill all the Christians. And so the Greek Christians have to humble themselves and beg the Catholic West for help. And the West sends help. It's called the what? The Crusades. 9 major crusades in 200 years. And we got, you know who led the 3rd crusade? Richard the Lionheart. And he left England, and who did he leave in charge? His brother John. And John raised taxes. And what was the story we all know? Who lived at this time? Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood, because King John was taking all the money because the brother Richard the Lionheart was fighting in the 3rd crusade. And do you know who led the 7th and 8th crusades against the Muslims? There's a big city in Missouri named after him. St. Louis. St. Louis, Missouri, right? If you go to St. Louis, there's a Forest Park and there's Art Hill with a big art museum. And at the top, there's a big metal statue of St. Louis on his Crusader horse going off to fight in the 7th and 8th Crusades. And when the Crusades end, the Muslim warriors pick up where they left off and they conquer Constantinople. And the year is 1453. This was the biggest city in Europe. This is where the East and West met, and it cut off the trade routes. So have you ever heard of Marco Polo? Right? The kids play that around the pool. Marco Polo, close your eyes, right? Marco Polo was an Italian from Venice, Italy, and in the 1200s, he left Venice, Italy, and went all the way over to India and China. And he worked for Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Remember Genghis Khan killed 30 million people? Well, his grandson's Kublai Khan. And so Marco Polo is over there for like, he's 17 when he first goes over, and he's over there for like, 20 years. And when he finally gets back to Europe, he's caught in a war because Venice and Genoa, Italy, didn't like each other. And so Marco Polo is captured and he's put in a jail cell in Genoa. And he tells his cellmate about all of his travels and about how these Chinese invented paper currency. You have paper currency in your wallet? China invented that during the Yuan dynasty. So they call their paper currency the yuan. And unfortunately, Kublai Khan printed too much of it and their economy cratered. But the Chinese invented printing on paper, where the Egyptians printed on papyrus reeds or animal skins called parchment. And the Chinese invented spaghetti noodles, right? You go have some spaghetti, that was invented by China. The Chinese invented the wheelbarrow, the compass, the piñata, right? They would have those things, the dragons in the street, and the Chinese invented gunpowder. And so here's Marco Polo in his prison cell telling his cellmate, he tells him about India and naked holy men. You're like, what? Yeah, India, they have these guys and they would like fast until they be, and all kinds of weird stuff that they do with the Hindus, they would have cows that would go to the bathroom, and the ladies would come up and to get their hands wet, and they'd bless themselves with the cow urine. I mean, that's what they did. And so Marco Polo was like writing all this stuff down, and the guy in the cell's like, no way, no, this is crazy stuff. And so his book was called Il Miliones, or The Million Lies. They thought it was a million lies, sort of like, Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox. The stories, if you've ever been up to Minnesota, and they'll have all this Paul Bunyan stuff, and it's like, well, that river was dug by this big, huge guy named Paul Bunyan, and he had this blue ox that would pull the plow, but it's made up stuff. And anyway, so we get done with Marco Polo, but that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. And so I didn't get a chance to go through it, but America started with this experiment of us being the king rather than the king being the king. And so it's a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top-down rule by kings, it's bottom-up rule by us. And where did the founders get their idea? From the Bible. What part of the Bible? The first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul, Israel. And so that's why they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. So in America, we get to be in charge of our lives. So you get to be the king of your own life. You get to decide where you want to live, who you want to marry, what clothes you want to wear. You don't have to wear a burqa if you don't want to. You can eat whatever you want. You can eat pork if you want to. You don't, right? Other countries don't, if you're in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, you don't have those freedoms, right? So in America, you get to make decisions about your life. And then all of us together make the decisions for the direction of the country, right? So you get to be the king of your life. All of us together are co-kings running the country. It's a bottom-up form of government versus the norm for world history, which is a top-down form of government. So Muslims conquer the Central Asia and cut off Marco Polo's land routes to India and China. And that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. So Columbus would have never set sail over here had it not been for jihad over there. And meanwhile, the Muslims continue to conquer, and they're now at the gates of Vienna, and the King of Spain is trying to stop them. And so we got two most powerful kings on the planet, the King of Spain and the Muslim Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. And in the middle of all this, the Reformation starts with Martin Luther. And so the King of Spain has two problems. He has the Protestant Reformation started on the inside of Europe and the Muslim invasion on the outside of Europe. And he tries to stop both and can't. And so he decides he needs to make a deal with the Protestants. It's called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. and it's the first treaty ever to recognize Protestants. But in the treaty, there's a little Latin phrase that had enormous repercussions. The phrase was cuius regio ius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against this Islamic invasion because they sort of want to kill us all. And so in the next century, different kings believed different things. And Europe broke into these countries that would fight each other. And so you had what the king believed the kingdom had to believe. If you didn't believe the way your king did, you were persecuted, you fled. And so northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland was Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, Serbia was Serbian Orthodox, Italy, Spain, France, Poland, Portugal, Austria remained Catholic. There were a group called the Mennonites following some guy named Menno. They were Protestants and they didn't get a country, but Russia said, hey, come over, we'll give you some land. Well, they get over there and they find out it's a buffer land between Russia and the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And the Russians are like, yeah, come, we'll give you all this land. But they didn't realize they'd be in the middle of fighting for a long time. And so over the centuries, the Mennonites became successful, and they were called kulaks, and they existed until Lenin decided to kill them all. And so that's when a lot of those Mennonites fled to America. But then England was Anglican, but you had to believe the way your king did. And so the King of England was Henry VIII. And he originally was Catholic, and he was married to the daughter of the King of Spain. And after 18 years, she, Catherine of Aragon, did not have a son. So Henry decides to divorce her and marry Anne Boleyn. Well, the Pope wouldn't recognize the divorce, and Henry VIII says, well, you know what? I'm just going to make myself my own Pope. He starts the Church of England, puts himself at the head, and he goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a nice guy to be married to. Well, his advisors suggested if he's serious about breaking from Rome, he should stop using the Latin Bible, get himself an English Bible. The German princes have Martin Luther's German Bible. That helped them to break away. He needed to get an English Bible. Well, it just so happens Henry VIII had William Tyndale burnt at the stake a few years earlier for translating the Bible into English. William Tyndale's last words were, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. And now the King of England wants an English Bible, so they take William Tyndale's work, polish it up, and they call it the Great Bible. And Henry VIII likes it and orders a copy of it put in every church in England. And this is the first time the common people in England can read the Bible in their own English language. And Henry dusts his hands and says, that's it, we've broken from Rome. But something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what's in the Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of Christ's church on earth. Henry VIII got to be around 400 pounds. He would only eat meat. He thought vegetables and fruit were sissy food. And back then, guys showed off their calves, right, with tight stockings. And like today, guys will show off their biceps. But back then, it was their calves. And he kept getting bigger and bigger. And they didn't have elastic. And so he would tie these stockings, and it would cut off the blood flow to his legs. And he ended up getting gout and these big open sores. And anyway, he needed to have his leg amputated, but the doctors didn't want. It would be like telling a guy, we need to chop off your bicep. And so it says, you tell him he needs his leg chopped off. No, you tell him. Nobody told him, and so he dies. And anyway, but before he dies is when he broke from Rome and he went on to have his 6 wives. And so a group starts that wants to purify the Church of England, and they're nicknamed the what? Puritans. And the king doesn't think he needs purifying, so he persecutes the Puritans. And there's another group that said it's beyond hope of purifying, we're going to separate ourselves, and they're nicknamed what? Separatists. And what's another name for them? Pilgrims. Yeah. So we have the Catholic Church, Henry breaks away, you got these Anglicans, you got these Puritans trying to purify the Anglican Church, and then these separatists that says we're just going to meet in secret. And so Henry doesn't like them, and then the next, you have his son Edward, and then Mary, and then you got Queen Elizabeth, and then you got King James. And these separatists flee. We call them pilgrims. I'm going to skip past some stuff. And they come to America, and they settle colonies. And so they look to the Bible for the colonies in New England as their example. But the King of England is looking to the Bible. But there's an interesting story in the Bible. The first 400 years out of Egypt, the Israelites do not have a king. They're ruled by the priest teaching the law. And so everybody in ancient Israel is taught the law, and everybody's personally accountable to God to follow the law. And so there's no king. But then the people sin, and they say, well, we want a king, and they get King Saul. So the King of England looked to the Bible as his authority, but he looked to the anointed King Saul and on period of the Bible. And the founders of America looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the pre-King Saul period. It's called the Hebrew Republic. We talked about how the most common form of government is kings, but one period stands out. It's ancient Israel. Around 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt, and for 400 years they don't have a king. And so that's what the colonies in America look to in the example, right? So does that make sense? So both England and America look to the Bible, but the kings of England look to this King Saul and on period, and the Calvinist Puritans and these New England pastors look to the pre-King Saul period. And the King of England's attitude was, yes, you can read the Bible in your own language, but no, you still got to believe what I tell you to believe. I'm the king. And so he would, you don't make up prayers, because you could make up a prayer that's wrong. So the government wrote all the prayers down in a book of common prayer. And you feel like praying, you just open it to the right page and read the prayer. And if you're caught making up your own prayers with some friends, the FBI will kick in the door and arrest you and drag you to the star chamber, room with stars on the ceiling, and they'll twist your arm and cut off your ear and brand you on the face as a heretic. And then put you, sort of like a January 6th hearing room, right? And then they will like put you in a cell and let you waste away for decades. And then they pass the 5 Mile Act. If you're caught preaching within 5 miles of a town and you've not gotten approval of the king, you're a criminal. And they'll drag you away to that star chamber. Then they have the Conventicle Act. Comes from the word covenant, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst. And so in Scotland, they called them covenanters, but they were like small groups, and they weren't just praying together, they were covenanting together. Like, we're going to be friends for life. and I'm going to give my life for you, and you give your life for me, and we're all going to, and the police didn't like that. And they later changed the name of it to the Riot Act. So you'd have your little Bible study, the FBI kicks in the door, pulls out a piece of paper and reads the Riot Act, which says everyone must immediately disperse or we're going to arrest you and stick you in that January 6th hearing room. And somebody that was caught during this time was John Bunyan. Not Paul Bunyan with the blue ox. This is John Bunyan. And he spent 12 years in prison, and that's when he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. And so if you were caught by the king, you were put in the Newgate prison, and that's where you would waste away. Anyway, so you have these people fleeing to America and founding colonies, and that's what the Pilgrims were. They fled from England to the Netherlands, and then from the Netherlands, they eventually fled to America. And these Pilgrims were going to land in Jamestown and submit to the king's government, but they got blown off course, and they landed at Cape Cod. And they're trying to sail south, but off the coast of Cape Cod, it's really shallow, and they get caught on the sandbar and almost sink. In the storm, there's 3,000 ships that have sunk off the coast of Cape Cod. And so the captain goes back to Plymouth Rock and says, too dangerous to sail, everybody off the boat. And they said, well, who's going to be in charge of us? There's no king-appointed person in our little boat. And so they do something unique. It's called the Mayflower Compact. And they take this covenant form of government. There's just a small group of us, and we're going to be friends for life, and we're going to covenant ourselves together, right? And they decide to covenant themselves into a civil body politic. And so it says, we, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, but revolutionary. It was a polarity change in the flow of power on planet Earth. Instead of top-down rule by kings and pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans, it's ruled up, bottom up by we, just us in this little boat. We're going to covenant together, and we're going to make the laws, and we're going to submit to, we agree to submit to the laws. It's a polarity change in this flow. Instead of top-down rule by a king through fear like a pyramid, it's bottom up like a tree, where every root and every tiny capillary root sucks in nutrients to keep the tree alive. Instead of divine right of kings, do what I tell you to do. It's we, the people. And where did they get their idea? From their little pastor, John Robinson. And this painting hangs in our U.S. Capitol Rotunda. And so it's called the covenant form of government, where you get blessings from God and you share them with your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. Right? So it's not the government taking away your stuff and redistributing it to supporters. No, it's you getting the stuff and then you voluntarily sharing it with your neighbor because you're doing it. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. Right? And so Puritan founding father John Winthrop says, this love among Christians is a real thing, not imaginary, necessary to the being of the body of Christ. We are a company professing ourselves fellow members of Christ. We ought to account ourselves knit together by this bond of love. We must make one another's condition our own. Rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us. So they're looking back to this first 400-year period of Israel before King Saul. And the King of England didn't like that. He liked the hierarchical form because he was at the top. And so he persecutes these Puritans, and they flee, and they found cities. And so you have New England founded by pastors. A pastor, John Lothrop, in his church found Barnstable, Massachusetts, and a pastor, Roger Williams, in his church found Providence, Rhode Island, and the First Baptist Church in America. Reverend John Wheelwright in his church found Exeter, New Hampshire, and Reverend Thomas Hooker in his church found Hartford, Connecticut. And so this is unique on planet Earth. At the time when you have Russian czars and Muslim sultans and Indian maharajas and the whole world's kings, here you have this little experiment going on in America where, and so you have a pastor, Thomas Hooker, founds Hartford, and his church members say, could you preach a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government? So he gives a sermon in 1638 titled The Foundation of Authority is Laid in the Free Consent of the People. And that's reflected in our Declaration, government from the consent of the governed. And it's different from Europe because the kings of Europe could care less about your consent. They're going to do what they want to do. They're not going to ask you, do I have your permission to do it? No. And then it goes on, the privilege of election belongs to the people. This is reflected in our Constitution. We the people. And so Calvin Coolidge says, Thomas Hooker's congregation of Thomas Hooker of Connecticut, as early as 1638, said in a sermon in the General Court, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. And so his sermon is written down, and it becomes the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is their constitution. The pastor's sermon is their state constitution, and they use it from 1639 up until 1818. They're using the pastor's sermon as their constitution for Connecticut. That's why it's called the Constitution State. And here's a plaque in England. It says, Thomas Hooker, founder of the state of Connecticut, father of American democracy. Another plaque, Thomas Hooker, Puritan clergyman, reputed father of American democracy. Here's a statue of Thomas Hooker holding a Bible on the old Capitol grounds in Hartford. At the base, it says, leading his people through the wilderness. On the side, he preached the sermon, which inspired the Fundamental Orders. It was the first written constitution that created a government. Here's another plaque. Here ministered Thomas Hooker, peerless leader in both church and state. Another plaque, Thomas Hooker, a leader, preacher, statesman who based all civil authority on the free consent of the people. This was a big deal in world history, so much so they chiseled it in stone so we wouldn't forget it. The world's ruled by kings and pharaohs. It's all top down, and they rule through fear. And over here, they're doing this little experiment like a greenhouse, and it's the free consent of the people. And here's another plaque in Hartford. They have lots of plaques in Hartford. This one says, near this site, May 31st, 1638, Thomas Hooker preached his famous sermon, "The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people." And near this site, the representatives of the people adopted as the fundamental orders of Connecticut. And what do the fundamental orders say? The people conjoin ourselves to be as one public state or commonwealth. So who are the people? It's the church members and Pastor Thomas Hooker. So you have a church group forming itself into a political group. And why did they do that? To preserve the purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus, which we now profess. Another plaque. This one says, Thomas Hooker's congregation established the form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Everybody's involved in their little church. Everybody's involved in the community government. And so in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it was the pastors and their churches that created the state. How could you say, Pastor, don't preach on politics when it's the pastor's sermon that's their constitution? How could you say church members don't get involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the church members? There were like no non-church members to be lazy and let them run stuff. The word polis, like politics, comes from the word polis, which means city. So what cities do you know of that have the word polis in it? Indianapolis. And then there's Annapolis, Maryland. And then there's Minneapolis, Minnesota. Polis means city, and politics is the business of the city. And in the city of Hartford, all there was the church. So the church had to be involved in the business of the city. They had to be involved in politics. And so they had one building called a meeting house. And that's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would gather together and do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. And that's where the rabbi would teach the law, but that's where they would do their city business. And so when the Revolutionary War starts, the British send over a military governor, Thomas Gage, and he outlaws meeting houses. We don't need the people meeting and discussing. Democracy is too prevalent in America. You just follow government mandates. We don't need you talking about and giving your input. You just follow. If the government doesn't mandate, you blindly obey like a zombie, right? You just do what the government mandates. It's easy. And but the founders in America said, no, we want to have a part in this. Calvin Coolidge says, the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man, in order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action. Whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. So they did an experiment, and the experiment was they realized the kingdom of God could not be forced by the government top down. They fled from Europe where kings were burning people at the stake, and they saw in the Bible that Jesus never forced anybody to follow him. One time he said something difficult, and many disciples said, this is a difficult saying, who can bear it? And they walked with him no more. He didn't run after them and say, you misunderstood me, please come back. Or he didn't run after him with a sword and say, get back or I'll chop your head off. No, he turns to Peter and says, you want to go too? There's the door. And Peter says, where else can I go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. It's almost as if Jesus said something difficult on purpose to shake away those following him for the wrong reason. Because there was a crowd following. He just multiplied loaves and fishes and had a crowd following him for a free lunch and wanting to make him king. He's like, no, this isn't the way it's going to happen. I got to shake away these people because they're materialistic. They're using the wrong reasons. And so in New England, they said, well, gee, if Jesus himself never forced anybody to follow him, we can't. And they thought, well, if the kingdom of God cannot be forced from the top down, how's it going to happen? They thought if the majority of the people had godly values, right? They're going to church and they're being preached to, and then they elect representatives with those values, then laws would be passed reflecting those values, and the values of the kingdom would come voluntarily from the bottom up, not forcibly shoved from the top down. And so this is what happened in America. Instead of divine right of kings, the Creator gives all the power to this one guy, the king, and he dispenses it to these lowly people, these subjects. We sort of leave out the king. And the Creator gives the rights to each one of us. And we're all equal. And we choose from amongst equals who's going to fix the potholes in the road and who's going to do all the government stuff, right? So Israel, everybody was taught the law, but what would motivate you to follow the law? By the way, Israel was the first nation that could read. Remember we talked about how Sumeria had 1,500 cuneiform characters, and we talked about Egypt having 3,000 hieroglyphics and China having 10,000. Only the upper class could read. When Moses comes down the mountain, he has the law in a 22-character alphabet. First letter's Aleph, second letter Beth. Sound familiar? It's so easy to learn, kids can learn it. So ancient Israel was the first nation where even children could read. Why? Because everybody's the king. And so the people are the king. The king needs to be educated. And so ancient Israel, everybody was taught to read. And but what would motivate you to follow the law? And so if you think of it, all governments that have ever existed in the world are somewhere on this line. One side is total government, the other side's no government. All right, everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power, concentrated power. Your fingers apart with the other hand, say separated power, separated power. Now back to the fist, concentrated power, concentrated power. That's world history. For most of world history, power is concentrated into the hands of the government. The pharaohs, the Caesars, the Kaisers, the sultans, and they rule through fear. And so it's very rare that you stretch the rubber band and give people the power, right? God took the Tower of Babel and scattered it so the power was separated. But in times of fear and panic, people let go of the rubber band and it snaps back into the hands of a king. And so if you take the power of a king and give it to the people, it would be anarchy. Everybody would do what they want. There's no government unless everybody is taught the law. Everybody has virtue. Everybody has self-control. Everybody has morals. And so you have to teach the people the Bible. So if you're going to get rid of the external laws, you have to replace it with more internal laws. It's like a parent gives the teenager the car keys and says, you're a good kid. You have internal morals. You can come home whenever you think it's right. But if you don't follow those internal morals, drink and drive and party, you're going to be pulled over by the police and put behind bars. So, teenager, you are going to be controlled, either voluntarily from the inside or forcibly from the outside. It's the same way with a nation. We're either going to be voluntarily controlled with internal morals, or we're going to say, there's no right, there's no wrong, do whatever you want. It's going to turn into chaos and lawlessness, and then everybody's going to say, government, please come in and restore order. And the government says, yeah, we'll restore order, we'll take away all your freedoms and put you in a cage. So in ancient Israel, everybody was taught the law. I was trying to think of a way of explaining it. Imagine if everybody downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. We all have GPS. You can get from one point to another. Imagine if you could download a behavioral app that would tell you how to act in real time. And it is monitoring your blood pressure and your voice volume, and it sees somebody's in the vicinity and you're getting louder and your heart's beating fast. It runs this algorithm. You're being tempted to lose your temper. And it starts, bzz, bzz, don't lose your temper, don't lose your temper. And then it's monitoring your bank account, and it sees it's a little low. And then it geo-positions, it sees you're in a store with expensive stuff and nobody's in the vicinity. And it runs this algorithm, bzz, you're being tempted to steal. Alert, alert, don't steal. Imagine if everybody downloaded a behavioral app, told you how to act all the time. Well, that's what the law was for ancient Israel. Everybody was taught the law. And the Levites were the computer geeks that help you to download the app. Right? You get these Levite priests, and they're like, okay, got to go to Apple Store, Google Play, or whatever, click by line upon line, precept upon precept, press this button here, this button there. And so everybody in ancient Israel downloaded the app called the law. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Israel had the key ingredient. There is a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He's going to hold you accountable in the future. You're about to steal something. Nobody's around. And then you think, God's watching me. he wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called the conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. People can go anywhere without fear. Women can, you don't have to lock your doors on anything, right? Because everybody's taught the law and God's watching, wants me to be fair, he's going to hold me accountable. Now, God knew the Israelites would sin, and rather than them live out the rest of their life anticipating being, I'm going to get judged, once a year they had the Day of Atonement, and they'd have the sacrifice, and they'd bring the blood and sprinkle it on the mercy seat, and everyone's sins in the nation of Israel were forgiven, and they all started the new year off with a clean slate. And obviously that is foreshadowing Jesus. He's our atonement, and we're forgiven not just for the past year, but for our entire life and throughout all eternity. Right? So anyway, I guess I'll end with that. God bless you. Thank you for letting me talk to you today.
Thank you.